Hi, welcome into Anita on the Mark. Of course, my co-host Nevin Shapiro. We've been with you throughout this entire P. Diddy trial, and a lot happened today. And our very dear friend, one of the best defense attorneys here in the New Jersey, New York area, Kathy Fleming, joining us. This will be her third time as a guest on our program. She's just too good. We have to have her come back time and time again. Guys, before we dive into it, a lot to discuss, a lot of questions for Kathy, that's for sure. We are live on X, we are live on YouTube, and we are live on Facebook. What does that mean? Our viewers, our listeners can be part of the show. Listener interaction. Post your questions. You've got questions. This is a great opportunity if you've got questions in regard to all that's gone down throughout this trial and specifically today, and I will recap for that for you in just a minute. We will be taking your questions and answering them to the best of our ability, but really Kathy's ability because she's the expert who's on the program this evening. So just to rewind here, guys, right? We know that Sean Diddy Combs is being charged with 5 different counts. One is racketeering conspiracy, which can get him 15 years to life. Number 2, sex trafficking of Cassie Ventura, which could get him 15 years. Transportation of prostitution of Cassie and others, a max of 10 years. Sex trafficking of Jane, again, 15 years. And transportation for prostitution of Jane and others, again, a max of 10 years. Okay? In regard to the RICO, this has been the most difficult for the prosecution to prove. Prior to the jury going into deliberation, the judge reminded them that there are 3 conditions that they need to confirm or agree upon to find Combs guilty. 1, that he used fraud, force, or coercion. Number 2, that he knew or recklessly disregarded the fact that there was force, fraud, or coercion. And number 3, that it affected interstate commerce. Okay, so that was the instructions that they were given. Now today, this evening, around 4:30, 5 o'clock this afternoon, the jury came back and said that they reached the verdict on 4 of the 5. 4 of the 5. The one that they are not on the same page with, that is count number 1, and that is racketeering. Okay, so that's where we stand right now. So Kathy, I want to bring you in here in regard to that news and it breaking today. Who do you think that benefits right now?
Right now, I think if you're going to read the tea leaves, I think it probably benefits the prosecution. The fact that the jury is hung, they can't agree unanimously on the elements beyond a reasonable doubt on the racketeering conspiracy charge, suggests to me that they did reach agreement unanimously on the 4 counts where they said they've reached agreement. But it's hard to imagine that there are people voting for conviction on the racketeering conspiracy, which is an ongoing pattern of racketeering acts and bad acts, and did not reach a guilty verdict on the other, at least 1 or 2 of the other counts. Juries frequently will do compromise verdicts. Juries will frequently say, we don't agree, so let's find it guilty on this and not guilty on that. Juries do crazy things. And, let's not forget the O.J. Simpson verdict that a lot of people thought was the craziest verdict in this century. So, juries do strange things. But I think if I were reading the tea leaves and if I were on the defense team tonight, I'd be upset. I would think that it is going to go against them. I will tell you one quick story. I had a partner who was trying a murder case. He was defending a alleged murder case. And the jury came back and their question was, if we don't find the person guilty of murder, can we find him guilty of the lesser included manslaughter? And they left, and everybody celebrated that, okay, we're not going to lose the murder count. And the jury came back 20 minutes later guilty on murder. So you never know what a jury's going to do until they speak.
Well, two things. Number one, and we've had you and a number of attorneys and federal agents who've been joining us on the program for the last few weeks, and all of them have said the same thing. This racketeering thing, the federal government, somewhat of a stretch. Like really hard to prove. He's not a mobster. Very, very difficult. So because of the conversations we've had on the program the last few weeks, Nevin, I think you would agree with me, right? Like, this isn't surprising, right?
No shock at all, Anita. I've been saying it from the jump. You know who you're going against. They're the heaviest power in our world, this United States government. They don't lose often. When they do, there's normally some trickery involved or some outside. I believe our last conversation with Kathy, I said, listen, I'm a numbers guy, 95, 96, 97%. I don't like to go against it. Her counter was, he has a lot of money and resources. No question about it. They don't come at you on two different coasts, West Coast and East Coast, if they're not bringing their A team and their A game, and they know they got you lined up dead to rights. This guy's next 12 hours are going to be the worst 12 hours since he's been on Earth. I promise you.
Well, I'm sure it's got to be. I'm sure he's not going to get a wink of sleep tonight. That's for sure. But Kathy, back to you, because very interesting, right? The judge. So the jury sends a note and says that, okay, we've come to a verdict on counts 2, 3, 4, and 5. We can't come to an agreement on the racketeering. So why the judge said, and apparently what's being reported is both the defense and the prosecutors. The prosecution said, go back in the room, try to make it work, continue to deliberate. Why do you feel that both the defense and the prosecution want them to try to give it another whirl at racketeering?
Well, I think that the defense probably argued at first, if they're hung, judge, and you should find it as a hung count. There's a lot that goes here for the defense on these cases. Acquittals are the best result we get, and sometimes, Nevin, we get them because we're good lawyers, and sometimes we get them because the facts help us. But if you don't get an acquittal, getting a hung jury is a pretty good verdict too. That's a win on the defense side when you have a hung. So if somebody comes back and says, look, we can't reach a verdict even on one count, I suspect that my answer would have been, well, if they're hung on that count, judge, so we should just call it a mistrial on that count. Now, the wrinkle in it is they've reached a verdict on 4 counts. And a lot of times when you're a defense lawyer and there's a hung jury, what you're hoping is somebody may go back and rethink whatever they voted on the other counts. So that, it's really hard to call these until you're really sitting there and you're watching the jury. But, in general, I don't think the defense really wants them to go back and keep trying. Prosecution certainly does, because they would prefer not to have a hung jury on even one verdict, and they would rather get whatever the answer is going to be. I think that if he is convicted on 4 counts or 3 counts, I think that the judge would put a lot of pressure on the prosecution not to retry the case for a hung count on a RICO. So there's a lot that's going on here, and nobody's able really to read the tea leaves.
So why? I'm sorry. Really quick, Nevin. I'm just curious. And so why today? Why? Because from what I understand, in watching CNN and all the other coverage as it was happening live, the jurors, they could have come in and given their verdict on the 2 through 5. But still return tomorrow and deliberate on the 1. Right. Why do you think that wasn't the case? Why do you think we didn't get the actual verdict? We know they've reached a verdict, but we didn't get the actual verdict today.
Right. I've actually had that happen in cases, both as a prosecutor and as a defense lawyer. I've had it on both sides. And generally, it's a really hard question. Do you want to give the partial verdict or not? Because once you take the partial verdict, it's set in stone. Whereas if you don't take it, things could happen when they go back in the jury room, especially if people are arguing it out. You may end up with another compromise or the rest of it. As a prosecutor, I generally wanted the partial verdict. I wanted to hear it. And, it didn't really, most of the time, if you're a prosecutor, if you get convicted on one count, you don't really care how many other counts or convictions. It's not a numbers game. It's a convict on something game. I would suspect, I wasn't there and I don't see the live coverage, so I don't know what the judge did, but I suspect the judge called the lawyers up and said, what do you want me to do? It's your call. Do you want me to take a partial verdict, or do you want to let them keep deliberating? And so I think it was likely the choices of the lawyers, if they agreed that, well, let's send it back and let them keep deliberating. And you can't fault it, because you don't know what they're going to come back and say. It's really hard to fault somebody with making that decision. And, so the whole process, let me just go on to explain what the process is. I've seen in the press, they refer to something called the Allen charge. What happens is when the judge gives his initial instructions to the jury on what your legal instructions are, he says to the jury, listen, you have an obligation to keep an open mind and not discuss the evidence until it's all in. And then once you are arguing and deliberating, you have an obligation to listen to other people's points of view, but don't surrender your firmly held beliefs just because other people are trying to convince you to. On the other hand, you really want to make sure that you are listening to them and seeing what reason really works out. It's kind of a be reasonable, guys. When you get a hung jury, as I said, as a defense lawyer, I generally would like, let's just get the hung verdict because that's a win. But the judge will send them back and do something generally called a modified Allen charge. The Allen charge is a dynamite charge, and it's really harsh. It says you have an obligation to go deliberate, and you really have an obligation to try to get to a verdict. And appellate courts have said that's too harsh. That's really different than your don't surrender your individual beliefs, even if other people are trying to convince you, be reasonable, but without surrendering your beliefs. So generally there's a charge that's modified. It's not quite as straightforward as, look, you have an obligation to go reach a verdict. But it creates an appellate issue if you get that, and it's an Allen charge as opposed to a modified Allen charge. So I think what happened is at that point, everybody agrees on what the language should be going back in, and the judge tells them, try not to surrender your own beliefs. My experience is that most of the time when a jury says they're hung, and particularly this jury, I think, has telegraphed that they're pretty well split. It's not an 11-1. Most of the time when they're hung, they stay hung. I don't see a lot of juries that have come out and told the judge we're hung on this count when there are multiple people disagreeing, where they really come back and they have a verdict. And it raises an appeal issue if the wrong charge is given.
Nevin?
Yeah. So, Kathy, what I wanted to ask you is, in a hypothetical situation, because you're a defense attorney, so assuming that this looks very bad for Diddy right this second, does his defense in a hypothetical situation, do they approach the prosecution for a plea?
No, I don't think so.
They got to just go the distance now.
It's really a little late for that. The verdict's in. I know if you watch Boston Legal and LA Law, you always see the people at the last minute, they're discussing a plea as the jury's out. Good lawyers on both sides have been discussing resolutions all along the way. And, if there were in fact hung verdicts, a lot of cases resolve after a hung verdict with a less onerous plea. But that's after the trial. I think at this point with 4 counts, first of all, I think if they happen to be acquittals, I think it might be malpractice if the defense at this point would say, let's go do a plea. But I don't think the prosecution's really going to be interested either. I think they've gone the whole distance, the whole thing.
They got their pound of flesh, yeah.
Right. I mean, it's possible. And as I said, good lawyers are always discussing resolutions that might work for people. during the trial, but they're pretty late in the day to do it at this point.
Guys, I want to talk
about
about.
what they're probably doing tonight is they're probably talking about what the appeal issues are in the case. Seriously.
Yeah. I want to talk about juror number 25, right? Because at one point in time, the jury number 5, who was selected as the four person, by the way, 42-year-old nursing home aide from Manhattan, mother of 2 children. She was selected as the four person. Wrote a letter to the judge saying jury number 25, they're concerned because cannot follow your instructions. They requested to the judge to talk to the jury or interview the juror number 25. And the defense team said, no, just try to work it out. How would you, I guess 2-part question here, Kathy. Number one, you hear that there's a problem with the juror. Do you think that benefits the defense, prosecution? You don't know. And how would you handle it on either side?
It absolutely benefits the defense, because when you have a note that comes out that says, the juror is not following the court's instructions sufficiently to the point where the foreperson is writing a note to the judge and basically ratting out the juror who's not paying attention. So the first thing I'm doing is celebrating, because now I may have a tainted jury and I may have a problem. I don't know what effect it is that the defense said, let's let them try to work it out, because you can waive issues on appeal. As I've told you before, one of the best lawyers I know for appellate work in the country is Alexandra Shapiro, who's working with this team. So I would assume she was consulted on this. I think if I were the judge, regardless of what the defense lawyer said, I would have been questioning the juror. Now, it has caused a problem right from the get-go, because what it says is now you're interfering with the jury's deliberations to some degree. You're trying to find out what's going on. You're not supposed to know what they're doing deliberating. There are cases that have been overturned because court officers have found notes in the deliberation room that talked about what was going on in the jury. And you're not supposed to know. They're supposed to be completely secret with just the jury. So as a defense lawyer, I'm not quite sure how I would have handled it, except that I would have been celebrating inside. And as the judge, I think I would have taken it out of the hands of the lawyers, unless I was pretty comfortable that the defense had waived whatever objection they might have. When you're on appeal, there are different standards, whether you've preserved an objection or whether you haven't. If you haven't preserved the objection, there's a plain error standard. It's a higher standard for reversal than if you have objected. So I don't know what I would have done in that situation, other than I would have been happy.
Nevin, you and I have been talking about this throughout our entire coverage of this trial. And both of us, you and I, have been surprised that this was not a jury that was sequestered. I know we asked you this before, but based on everything that has happened, right? And this isn't just, the reason juror number 25 is there because juror number 26 was replaced by juror number 25. Like, are you still looking back at all that has unfolded here, especially now in deliberation? Are you surprised that this is a jury that has not been sequestered at all, Kathy?
No, I don't think nobody wants the jury to be sequestered. It makes them miserable. It makes them make shorter shrift. They're unhappy. They're really in a bad place when they're sequestered. It's really not nice, especially on a longer trial. And the last thing anybody in that courtroom wants is an unhappy jury. Now, if I'm a defense lawyer and the prosecution's making them unhappy, that's okay. But it's not. It would be the judge doing it. Juries love judges. Judges play very well to juries. I don't ever want my jury sequestered. It just makes a miserable, as I call my grandchildren, a grumpy, dumpy, boo-boo head group of people. And you don't want that. You want people who are not so aggravated with what's going on. This jury it is an anonymous jury, meaning that people are not supposed to know who they are because they don't want anybody tampering or doing whatever. But this really isn't one of those cases where you're concerned about physical violence and people are going to try to do something bad to the jury. The concern, I think, would be much more of the press hounding the jury. So, I think nobody would want them sequestered.
I have a question, Kathy.
Mhm.
So based on now, obviously it's federal, so we're not able to really take the temperature, the real temperature of what's going on inside this courtroom. What do you think, based on whatever has come out, that you think, how good do you think of an appellate argument does Diddy have, based on what you've been able to surmise?
I think he's got some decent issues. I think the juror number 25 is a decent issue. I think that some of the, evidence is a hard thing to get a case overturned on unless it's incredibly prejudicial or there's a lot of error in it. And so I think those are hard ones. But depending on what the prior bad acts were that they let in, there's always appellate issues. The biggest one, the way most federal cases get reversed, is if there's the jury instruction that's incorrect. If the judge has given a jury instruction that does not accurately and completely describe what the jury should be looking for. So that's what I would be poring over. And what happens is at the end of the trial, before closing arguments, when both sides have rested, there's something called a charge conference. And the lawyers for both sides meet with the judge before the closing arguments, and they go over what they think are the appropriate instructions for the court. And you've sent in what you think are the right instructions before the trial started. And then now at your Rule 30 conference before you close, you're able to fine tune them and argue what you think is appropriate evidence, appropriate instructions, and what are not appropriate instructions. And that may be the single most important aspect of the entire trial. And it's when you're the most exhausted. And if you're lead counsel and about to close, you're also worrying about closing when it's over. So, I don't know what they're going to have on legal issues. It's a good team. I suspect there are some pretty decent areas for reversal. On the other hand, the numbers are bad in terms of who gets convicted at trial. I think your 95% number is 95% of all cases plead out that are brought. And then at the trial, it's actually a little higher. It's something like 15 to 16% are acquitted after a trial on the merits. The numbers have changed a little bit. But in terms of appellate review federally, it's about 5% of cases that are reversed. It's very small.
And I think what you're referring to, Nevin, and we talked about it last week, and that was when there were a lot of like bad reports out there, incorrect reports that, the prosecution is dropping sex trafficking. No, they're dropping aided and abetting. They're dropping alleged, as opposed to the crime itself. And that was what was reported. That language is what Kathy was talking about, that happened a good week ago. And there was a lot of misreports. I want to tee this up for you, and curious to get your thoughts on this. The jury requested testimony of 3 incidents that happened with Cassie. 1 at the LA hotel and 2 that happened at a film festival, and also asked to review testimony from Daniel Phillips, who was a male escort who testified that he was paid to have sex with her numerous times and also witnessed Diddy physically abusing her in that New York City hotel room at the Intercontinental. Also, the judge has received the judge has received like 6 or 7 notes from the jury. Is that normal?
Yes.
Is that normal, Kathy?
Notes from the jury are frequent. Yes.
Okay. And they wanted the definition of whether giving drugs to someone who asked for them qualifies as distributing controlled substances. And so,
right.
And so the judge responded, the word distribution means actual constructive or attempted transfer. To distribute simply means to deliver, to pass over, to hand over something to another person, or to cause it to be delivered, passed on, handed over to another person. So distribution does not require a sale. So those were a few things that the jury requested during deliberation. What does you mentioned tea leaves? What do those tea leaves tell you?
I think those are 2 separate issues. When I've listened to jury instructions on both sides, as you listen to them, as the judge is reading certain instructions, you're thinking, oh my God, I can never win this case. And then when you hear other ones, you say, oh my God, I can never lose this case. I mean, they really go to both. But when you have a specific question like that, and then there is an answer that comes out that basically says distribution's giving the drug as opposed to selling it. If what they were hung up on is distribution of the narcotics as a predicate act, did it have to be sold? Or if somebody asks you for the drugs and you give it to them, is that distribution? And the judge's response there basically says, yeah, that's distribution. I mean, that's how I read it. If you're the defense on that question, you're saying, Judge, don't just read that one question and answer. You've got to read the whole thing about the narcotics so that they have the full amount of instructions and they don't just take one out of context. But that question clearly was aimed at if somebody asked for the drugs. So somebody wanted them, they voluntarily were asking for drugs. Is it still a crime if you give it to them? And I think the instruction that was given there clearly says yes. As long as you meet the other elements beyond a reasonable doubt. The testimony that they wanted read back, I thought went to the issue of whether there was coercion, because the coercion doesn't have to be a physical coercion as the judge has instructed it. It can be a financial one. It can be, an emotional one. It can be all sorts of things. So I think if I recall reading what the testimony was, that horrible, the notorious video where he's kicking and beating his girlfriend at the time was when she was trying to leave a freak off. I seem to recall that was what the testimony was. So that might go to the jury wanting to know, is that coercion? My recollection as well is that the prosecution hammered in that they only needed one instance to prove this. They didn't need to show 35 acts of coercion. One would suffice. So that's how I read that, to the extent I'm reading tea leaves.
I want to ask you something, Kathy. So let's assume, based on your initial answer to how it looks for Diddy currently, let's say he doesn't get convicted on the RICO. Mm-hmm. What is he staring at right now?
Well, if he is convicted on the sex trafficking, he's got a mandatory minimum of 15 years. So remember, in the federal system, there is no parole. You only get 15% off for good time behavior. And you can get a little bit of time off if you meet one of the programs that they have in the prison, or, for furloughs and stuff. But you do most of your time federally, unless there are certain acts that can cut that back. But
I can confirm that.
Yes, he's right. You CARES Act, right? You benefited from the CARES Act.
First Step Act as right. Well, yeah.
Yeah. So there are things that can do it, but in general, and one of the things, let's talk about what his defense lawyers are doing tonight. I suspect they're with him at jail. I suspect they're with him and they're talking to him and they're saying, look, tomorrow, no reaction. When the jury verdict comes back, just stoically take it no matter what. And we always have appeal issues, and we still have sentencing, and, all is not lost, even if you're found guilty. So let's take it one step at a time, and I'm sure they're going over the appeal issues, and they're trying to support him. And I'm sure everybody is exhausted at this point. I can't describe how much it takes out of you to try a case. You're on your feet in the courtroom from 9 to 5, and you're working from 5:05 until 2 a.m. and getting back up at 6. And it's emotionally tolling. And particularly when your client's in jail, you've got to go travel to the jail, which is not easy. And you've got to get in, and you waste that time. So I think that I think right now he's facing significant time if he is convicted. I'm sure they'll do as good a job as you can on a sentencing memo to show. But if you got mandatory minimums, you're facing at least 15.
And excuse me, Nina, can the judge give him an upward departure based on that?
He can give him an upward departure based on he can't do it based on the mandatory minimums, but he can find that there were aggravating circumstances. He can find there were allegations that he obstructed justice and tried to do witness tampering, that he can find under the sentencing guidelines that there are additional points. The way it works is, so let's assume you get convicted either by plea or by a jury. You meet with the probation officer and they take all your background because they want to give the judge a sense of who you are. This judge knows. This judge has heard a lot about this guy. And since the defense chose not to put witnesses on, by the way, I don't disagree with that decision. But since they chose not to, he hasn't seen any good side. So if there is a conviction here, it's going to be an uphill battle. But what the defense has to do is say to the judge, okay, you've seen all this bad stuff, but let us tell you who this guy really is. And here's all the good stuff. And you try to do that. You try to talk about why he should get a break and why he's a decent person, etc. So I don't know. The judge, what they do is the judge then takes the pre-sentence report, he takes the memos, and he's required to calculate the federal sentencing guidelines. What's the base offense level? Are there aggravating figures where you add points onto it? Are there mitigating factors where you deduct points? If you plead guilty, you get 3 points off for pleading guilty off what your score is. And that's the starting point. It used to be mandatory and now it's only advisory. And what the judge then says is, okay, well, I'm bound by the mandatory minimums, but my guidelines are X. And for these reasons, I'm going to impose a sentence of whatever. And he has to he has to explain his reasons for a sentence. And if he gives upward departures or downward departures or variances, which are things that are not accounted for in the sentencing guidelines, he's got to explain that. It's a complicated process. Sometimes people won't plead guilty because the offers are just terrible. You know, you look at the offer and the only thing you're really being offered is that 3-level decrease for pleading guilty. And people say, look, I have a shot at this. I'm going to go try the case. And so a lot of times we describe it that the trial is a long sentencing hearing. We expect that the client's going to be convicted, but they're going to do better after trial because the judge is going to get to know the person and not just, hear a guilty plea. Here, he has just seen one bad thing after another that this guy has done. And they didn't bring in any character witnesses. They didn't bring in people to talk about how, he rescued his housekeeper's son and let him go to school and paid all the tuition, the kinds of things that you hope you can bring out to a court to help show that the overall person's not this horrible guy.
Yeah. Anita, let me say, excuse me, Anita, let me just say something on top of what Kathy just said. So when the PSR, pre-sentencing report, is done, okay, so that's done by probation office of the court, really, which is sort of team government, Team USA. It doesn't bode well for the defendant. Like, let me just tell you, it doesn't bode well. He could run multiple charities and give away zillions of dollars, and they're gonna send him up. That's just what they do. And I'm not only speaking from my own firsthand knowledge of this, of what I went through, but I've seen others PSRs along the way, and it's just never favorable.
And not only that, guys, I mean, listen, as Kathy alluded to, the video in the hotel and him, just beating Cassie, you can't unsee that, right? Kathy, two things really quick, because we do have a question from one of our listeners, our viewers right now. I want to tee that up for you. But you said you agreed with the defense to not call any witnesses.
Right.
Why?
I think we actually talked about this on an earlier show. If you're a defense lawyer and you do your case well, you're bringing your defenses out all during the prosecution's case. You're getting what you need to prove your case out of the witnesses who are testifying for the prosecution, unless you have a client that from the beginning is somebody who can take the stand, who's going to stand up well to cross-examination, look the jury in the eye and say, I didn't do it. Or you've got real substantive evidence to show that, alibi or whatever else. But my feeling has always been, try to get as much of my defense out during the cross-examination, during the prosecution case. And then if I have a pretty weak defense, they've put on 50 witnesses and I've got 3 who are going to say I knew him in Little League and he was a good guy. That's pretty weak. That's the nicest you can get somebody to say. My view is you're better off calling no one and then saying to the jury, look, they didn't sustain their burden. we didn't have to call anybody. They haven't sustained their burden of proof, and we don't have to put anything on. So my view is, I had heard from the press, whether it's true or not, but I guess they said in court that they had like 3 or 4 witnesses, and I didn't think Diddy was going to testify. And that's his decision. It's not his lawyer's decision. And I think that at that point, if I only have 3 or 4 witnesses, unless they really are going to hit a home run, I'd rather just do none and argue to the jury exactly what Mark Agnifilo argued, which is they didn't prove their case.
This is a question from Italian in Laguna Beach. So obviously somebody who's joining us from California. If counts 2, 3, 4, and 5 were not guilty, there wouldn't even be a debate on count 1, correct? Question mark. I think it's guilty on 2 through 5, causing the debate on count 1.
Well, I that's what I said at the beginning of the show, was that's what it certainly seemed to me, but they are supposed to take each count separately. I've had lots of verdicts where it made no sense. Somebody was convicted of conspiracy to commit money laundering, and they didn't get convicted of money laundering. And it was just, there were verdicts that just don't make sense when you look at them as a whole. I tend to agree with our California brother here, but it probably is guilty, and that's why they're continuing. But you never know. You never know till the jury comes back. Of course, the last time I predicted a guilty verdict was live television with O.J. Simpson. And they cut to the verdict right after I predicted the guilty verdict. And of course, I was wrong.
All right. So obviously we unpacked a lot. So what happens tomorrow? The jury is scheduled to come back at 9 a.m. The judge, as well as the defense and the prosecution, has asked them, get back in that room, continue to deliberate, try to come to some type of agreement on count number 1, which is racketeering. Hypothetically speaking, Kathy, Nevin, let's say that doesn't happen. They come back at and keep in mind, what we've been hearing is they want this trial done by July 4th weekend. They want this done. And apparently court's closed on Thursday, although the judge said, we will open court for them. We don't want them to feel that they have to be rushed tomorrow. But with that being said, what if they just tomorrow, by the end of the day tomorrow, they can't come to agreement? Kathy, do you think at that point in time, they'll let the 4-person read the verdict for 2 through 5?
I think that they probably will wait until they either have a verdict or they have a hung jury on the verdict of the one count that no one's reached agreement on. And they won't do it just because it's the end of the day. And it is the right call to let this jury keep deliberating, even if they have to come in on a holiday. Although I bet a lot that they don't want to come in on a holiday, so they will have a verdict one way or another. He won't stop the case until they come in and say, we are just hopelessly deadlocked. Those are really the words. We are hopelessly deadlocked. When I was a prosecutor, I had a case where the jury was deadlocked on the main count. It was a drug case, and we took a partial verdict, and they in fact convicted on the other counts. I was a prosecutor at that time. And I kept insisting to the judge, send them back. I don't want to have to retry this case. And finally, a note came out that said, juror number 11 has locked herself in the bathroom and refuses to come out or speak to us anymore. We are not going to reach a verdict on this count. And the judge said, I think that's enough. And I'm going to declare that it's a hung verdict on that count. It's a mistrial on that count.
So if that happens, and very interesting, earlier, and actually prior to us starting the program, you said that you think that he could get more time for sex trafficking than he could have been for racketeering, because what we've been told is that he could potentially get life for racketeering.
Well, he can potentially get life on any of them, on the sex trafficking too. It's real. The judge has a lot of discretion on what he thinks is appropriate. My experience in the New York area, and as opposed to, for example, Florida or Texas, where I've also tried cases, my experience is that the judges don't try to really clobber people to the extent that they could, or I see it in other districts. They really do try to be fair. And a lot of times, this is the cynical part of me, I think they try to go below the guidelines, even with a big sentence, because it takes away some of the issues for appeal. So I don't really know what would happen here. You know, he's old enough that a 15-year sentence is a significant sentence. And I don't think it's going to matter whether it's RICO or sex trafficking. For the purposes of the guidelines, you group all the counts together anyway when you're calculating what the guidelines are. I haven't done the exercise, but I suspect they're pretty high for him. And I don't think it's going to matter in terms of a sentence.
And just to clarify again, so it's 15 years for sex trafficking, and there's 2 counts of that. One for Cassie, the other one for Jane.
Right.
You don't combine those. He doesn't get 30.
Yeah, you can. A judge can what they do. So they look at the guidelines, for example, and then they look at how much time. If the guidelines say your presumptives get sentences that you get 11 years, and you've been convicted on 2 counts that are 5 years each. That the judge can say these are consecutive. I'm going to run the sentences on these consecutive to each other. Most of the time, if the counts have a lot of space in them, such as sex trafficking, what they will do is they will run them concurrently, which means that they sentence to 15 years on count 1, and concurrent to that, they sentence 15 years on count 2. What's interesting about that is if you go up on appeal and you get count 1 reversed, you've still got it on count 2. So it's the judge has a lot of discretion in terms of what he wants to do for sentencing.
Interesting. Nevin?
Well, I pled for 10 years. My judge gave me 20.
Horrible.
I mean, that, like, where I stand, Anita.
I know.
You too, Kathy, for that matter. We've had this discussion. So, like, your life's in their hands. If you roll the dice, you better win. You better win, because you're just looking down the barrel.
I'm not in any way minimizing what he's facing here. And it's, I've spent a lot of time in jail with my clients. I joke all the time that the government owes me an embezzlement free, because I've spent enough time behind bars, but I get to go home at the end of the night. And I know that's a huge difference. It's really hard. A 10-year sentence federally is a big sentence. 20-year sentence is a big sentence. And even when things come along like the First Step Act or the CARES Act, or, in COVID, there was compassionate release, it's still, it's a really big part of your life. And it also depending on the sentence, depends on where you get to spend your sentence. Uh-huh. If you have more than 10 years, or you are not an American-born American citizen, you aren't eligible for a camp. And, the camps, they're not fun, but they're a lot better than the maximum security places that a lot of people go. So, there's an awful lot of factors. We're trying to dumb this down so that we can just talk about what the main things are, but there's an awful lot that goes into these. I tell people all the time, the most important part of a process, when I'm a defense lawyer, there are 2 things that are really essential for me. The first is to really review the discovery. And I do it before I talk to the defendant. I say to them, don't tell me your version of it. Let me look at the evidence and see what I think they can prove. And then we'll talk about it. I have ethical obligations. I can't suborn perjury, and I won't. And, I can't make up stories to make it better, but I can at least look at the evidence and tell them this is what the evidence says to me. And then the second part of it, and because a lot of clients do plead guilty because they are facing the barrel, and most people don't have a risk tolerance to go forward if they know they're going to get a much better sentence if they plead guilty, is the sentencing and going through the pre-sentence investigation report and that procedure and what you do on sentencing memos. It's crucial. Those are the 2 really key parts.
Anita, Kathy is making points that to the layman person out there who thankfully never has to go through this process. It is so invasive, and it's exasperating. And let me just tell you, you're thinking it's not like buying a car. Take a couple grand off the price and this and that. Like, a year is a year. A day feels like a week. A week feels like a month, and a month feels like forever. Okay. And I'm telling you, the fact that I'm standing here after serving 3,701 days inside federal prison, which is 10 years and 2 months, it is miraculous. And I'm talking mentally, not physically. Miraculous. I'm alive. Mentally, that I'm even here to have this show with you. What this guy's staring at is some Elroy Jetson type stuff out of space.
Well,
That's what he's looking at as a number.
let's talk about that, and we'll continue for just a few more minutes, because really, Nevin, this is, Kathy is so brilliant and so excellent at what she does, and again, laying it out for us to really understand what's happening on the legal side. But you've been there. What I mean, obviously different crime, different situation, but like, what, and Kathy, you've been there with defendants, right? Like we're sitting here and we're saying, yeah, we probably think that he's been found guilty on 2 through 5, at least a few of those counts. So, what's he going through? Like, I would imagine he can't sleep. Kathy,
Yeah.
you said his attorneys are in there with him. Do
Right.
you think that he's on suicide watch? What do you think is happening right now, Nevin?
So, God bless Kathy. She is incredible in her craft, but she's never been on that side of the fence to stay, right? Overnight. She's going home at night, no matter what. And let me just tell you, it's one thing, going to prison is traumatic in any form or respect, right? It's traumatic. But if you get a year and a day or 24 months, your ego's bruised and you're miserable and you can't see your parent, your family at night. You can't. You're going to be home pretty soon. It's going to go quick. You'll come out with a different perspective and probably lose some weight and get yourself in shape. It's like a fat farm, if you will, right? For a year or two. But when you get a decade plus, Anita, like, I think I've shared this with you, being on a bus, leaving the transit in Oklahoma, going to Louisiana for a 14.5-hour drive, leaving at midnight, 1 a.m., with a 17.5-year remaining sentence. You tell me what your thoughts are. Yeah. So this guy doesn't even know what's coming his way. He still thinks he's Puff Daddy, Love. He's inmate number 8 digits.
You really think so, Kathy? I mean, and again, I'm going by the reports. When this hit, obviously it was around 4:30 this afternoon. I immediately turned on CNN and all the news organizations, and those that are in the courtroom said that his body language was not good.
Yeah, no, I think Nevin describes it incredibly well. I will tell you, just, when the defendant, the court says, please stand, I stand next to the defense lawyer stands up too. It is horrible. It is, even while you're waiting for a verdict, and I'm happy to say I've had quite a few acquittals, but I am physically sick waiting to hear what the jury is going to say, because I understand how important it is. And I do get to go home. I do get to go home and hug my kids. And I feel horrible for my clients when they lose. I feel horrible for them. And part of that is because well, Anita, you know me, I like everybody. And I really get to like most of my clients. The good people do bad things sometimes, and good people get mislabeled, and good people get accused of things they didn't do. And, it's really a hard thing to watch it. I don't know if he's on a suicide watch. He's in the SHU, the special housing unit. So that's pretty rigorously watched in any event. I hope for his sake he's not, because if you want to make his life even worse and more tortured right now, putting him on a suicide watch makes it even worse. I mean, you're a caged animal who's being watched on full time, and you have absolutely zero privacy, and it's at one of the lowest points of your life.
It's as bad as it gets.
Yeah.
It's as bad as it gets, Anita. And let me just tell you, and I'd rather comment it after we do our last show based on the verdict, because he hasn't been convicted yet, so he still has a fighting chance as of right now when we're doing this show. But I'll go into some graphic detail, Anita, of what he's looking at if convicted, because I promise you, it's what he's going through and what he's going to go through.
I do think that even if he is found guilty here, it is only round one, because the sentencing is round 2. And I've been very pleasantly surprised by a number of judges that really gave sentences that I thought were more than fair under the circumstances. I'm sorry for what you went through. I haven't had that. I haven't had somebody who pled out to something that was 10 years and got 20. That's just horrific. And, the reason that doesn't happen very often is because defense lawyers talk, and you know who those judges are, and you know who those prosecutors are, and you don't plead anybody guilty when you see a judge who goes off the reservation like that. So I think that the end of the road is after an appeal if he loses his appeal. And I've had I've had situations where the Second Circuit has said, oh, well, this was really done wrong and this was really done wrong, but we're still not going to overturn the verdict. That's the worst.
Right. Yeah, and Anita, let me expand upon what Kathy just said. So one of the things that you maintain when you're in this situation, assuming he gets convicted, is the hope that remains within you. Is that hope? I'm going to beat it. They got it wrong, but then, like what Kathy just said, that appeal comes denied. It's officially real. Stamp. It's real. It's over. And then the only thing he can do is look for the softest landing he can possibly find through programming. And, if Donald Trump was in for 15 to 20 more years, maybe he'd have a shot. But other than that, lights out.
Just out of curiosity, during that appeal process, does he stay where he's at right now, Kathy, or
generally yes, but not always. I would try to move him depending on what level he gets or something on a sentencing. Generally, you're better off not being at the MDC because you can start with a real life. The problem is, depending on where you go, Nevin made a reference to Oklahoma. If you have to go from Boston to New Jersey, you can get shipped through Oklahoma on a bus. I mean, it's lunacy. And so, and you lose if you have to come to court for arguments. A lot of times clients will say to me, I don't want to be there for the appeal because I'll lose where I am. I'll lose my privileges. I'll lose my place in line. I would prefer you waive my position. I mean, you could do a whole series on prison, and I see a note talking about he's not a good person, so he kind of deserves what he gets kind of thing. Nobody here is in any way trying to justify what he did. But there's a difference between doing things that are inappropriate and doing things that are criminal. And, I would not be comfortable sitting on a jury saying whether somebody was a criminal or not. And I was a federal prosecutor, and I was a chief in a federal prosecutor's office, a Big Ten office. It's very hard for me to look at it and not see some good in people. And it's also, even if people need to be punished, and I do think punishment has its place in society, there are limits to it. And you have to start looking at what happens along the way. And is there rehabilitation? And did he do anything that was good in the world that sort of not makes up for it? That's the wrong term, but that should also be considered in connection with the bad things he did. This celebrity lifestyle, if we've learned anything, it's that a lot of money and celebrity status seem to get people to do things that if I asked them to do it at a bar this weekend, I don't think they would. I'm not justifying it. I'm simply trying to point out the realities of what he's facing.
So, Kathy, do you believe, if, again, we don't know if he is convicted and he has to spend some time, obviously, whether that's 15 years plus, will he be in general population?
I think so. He'll want to be. He will want to be. He won't want to be isolated. It really is awful to be isolated. So,
and you don't think that his life would be in jeopardy on that level in general population? I mean,
No.
Nevin, you'd actually be somebody better to answer this question.
I agree with that. I my view would be no. My view is he would be fine. He's a celebrity. He'd be a celebrity in jail.
Nevin?
Yeah, he's going to be in general population. I think his hardest transition is going to be dealing with the outcome, if not favorable for him right now. That's going to be a very difficult process because now he's an official felon. He's got an official BOP number. He has a number already, but now it's going to stick. It's not going to leave. And his transition is going to be now. He is going to go into a general population because you can't possibly live your life in solitary confinement mentally. You just can't do it. And yeah, he's
But
going to be
Nevin, do you feel that, like, if, let's say, P. Diddy showed up in one of the jail, because I know that you were in several, right? Like, you spent like 2 or 3 years.
I've been with Madoff, Jeff Skilling from Enron, Bernie Ebbers from MCI WorldCom. I can go into some rappers and some other, figures that have pop status. Let's just say.
So how do you think he'll be received?
He's going to be fine.
Okay.
He's going to be fine. He's going to have. It's not going to be like true. He's not going to have like true friends in there. He's going to have guys with angles trying to get underneath him for their own gains and whatnot. So whether it's protection or what, he's going to be okay. He's going to make it. He'll make it. He's not going to be comfortable because he's not living on Star Island, but he's going to make it.
There are people, the young kid, he was 20, I think, right? The Boston bomber, that, horrible. He did a horrible thing. I cannot justify it in any sense of the word. Yeah. And he is in a maximum federal security place. And he is in basically solitary confinement. He gets out an hour a day. The conditions are horrific. You don't have a television, you don't have a radio. People think people always talk about these are club feds. They're not. I actually think his brother, who committed suicide, ended up in the better place, because it's just to be 20 years old and spend the rest of your life in those conditions. I'd be begging to be put out of my misery.
It's called ADX, Anita, and it is it's the most secure prison in the United States. Max security prison, where El Chapo was. He was transferred out for medical reasons to a medical facility. It's serious. I mean, death is a better option.
Kathy, some final thoughts before we let you go.
Well, it's an interesting trial. It's very unusual. This is a lot of what he's got. Most people who go through what he's going through do not have. He's got supporters, he's got friends, he's got the resources to have a dream team of lawyers and investigators. He's been able to square up the odds to the extent you can do it. And I think that, it highlights for me a lot of the injustices of the justice system, because if you don't have the money and the resources to do that, you can't even up the odds the way he's been able to do it. I will tell people, people always talk about how easy it is to judge somebody's guilty. Until somebody has somebody close to them in their family, it's really hard to explain what people are going through. And I want to make it clear, I'm not justifying at all when people do things that are bad and they deserve to be punished. But there really you really do have to look at the human side of it and try to make it, as understandable as possible. The public has a right to be kept free and safe. And, we have the right to put people in jail. And, if you got me going, I would talk about how I think, particularly for first nonviolent offenders, boot camps are better, and trying to make people rehabilitated so they don't learn more skills in jail than they had before they went in, and try to give them useful skills that they can use when they get out. There's a whole bunch we can do, but we're limited. We're limited by what do. You got a P. Diddy who, no matter what else you say, this guy is a despicable human being. He did horrible things, and, he was arrogant about it to boot. He has civil suits, which he has, settled a bunch of them, and he has other things that are going on. But I'm sorry, I feel badly for anyone going through what he's going through. It's just a hard thing to have him go through. Doesn't mean I feel any less badly for the victims. I do. It's horrible what the victims have had to go through too. But there's more to it than what we read in the newspapers.
I have a technical question for you, Kathy, that just came to mind. And I'll preface it by saying this. I think he's got a lot of money riding on this last count. If they find him guilty on this RICO, what's the asset forfeiture at this point?
You know, I'm sure they have civil forfeiture actions in any event. I don't know what they have on the other counts. I haven't looked at that. But what we're talking about, Anita, is that there are specific statutes in the federal system that allow you to take the proceeds of any crime and forfeit them. So, for example, if you're involved in a fraud and it's $1 million fraud, even if you got 100,000, you will owe $1 million in forfeiture, and that's different than restitution. The restitution's on top of that. And there's also criminal fines. So it's going to be expensive, but he's wealthy enough that he can weather any of those storms. It's not, you know, where he is and what he's doing, money can't solve this problem.
Nevin, final thoughts.
Just a bad time to be P. Diddy. Those are my final thoughts.
That's an understatement.
Yeah, he's the hours and the sand in the hourglass are draining fast.
Kathy, always great when you join us on the program. This is your third time with us, and every time I leave here feeling so much more in the know, so much more intelligent. I've learned so much from you through this process, and both Nevin and I in Beyond Media Group, who produces this program, thanks you for your time, my friend. Thank you so much.
Anytime.
Nevin, great job tonight. You know, obviously your experience in sharing what you went through with our viewers and our listeners, it's priceless. It's so valuable, because really, who else has experienced what you have and can really attest to what P. Diddy's going through this evening. So thank you for being so open and so candid, my friend.
I wish I wasn't on this show, and I wish I didn't have this experience to share. But thank you for the gesture. Anyway.
You got it. And listen, we thank everyone for tuning in, subscribing. Our last episode went over 40,000 views. We are so grateful. Hopefully we're providing great content and great information for you, so that you're more knowledgeable and more in the know when discussing this P. Diddy trial in this case with your coworkers or friends or family. And please know how much we appreciate you subscribing and following our program. Not sure what's going to happen tomorrow. Again, what we do know, 9 a.m., the jurors are going to reconvene. They're going to get in that room. The judge has asked them to continue to deliberate. They want both the prosecution, defense, and the judge. They want these jurors to come to a decision whether guilty, not guilty, on a verdict of RICO, the #1 count. Will that happen tomorrow? We don't know. Will it happen Thursday? Will it not happen till after the 4th of July weekend? What we do know is that we will be here for you, and whether we go live or we post a show we will have reaction to the final verdict of what has been decided and what happens next. So we will see you then.
Good night.
Good night.